Welcome to my presentation. My name is Zamorano, and I'll walk you through what is my adaptation of the Flower and Haze composing model for a second language writing. First, what is the composing model? Flower and Haze developed a model to illustrate the different processes that a writer goes through. It was developed in 1984 for native writers that used their native language. It accounts for the different cognitive processes that we go through either before, during, or after writing, including revisions, previous knowledge, and everything in between. Before we dive into the model itself, I'd like to say why this model in particular. This model felt a lot more, I felt a lot more comfortable adapting this model for L2 writing being a student. It felt like I can manipulate it a lot more comfortably while being just a student that has no previous linguistic background. With that being said, this model also details three major steps during the process and one before. So it also is a lot more lenient with someone that wants to illustrate exact points when we try to write something. So let's dive in. This is the Haze and Flowers composing model. Here we have three major bubbles. The first one is the writer's long-term memory. This would be where the knowledge of the topic, the knowledge of the audience, the writing plans for the task ahead. This is where pretty much all the previous information is that the writer has available before and during writing. Like, this is where, for instance, if I wanted to write a letter, this would be who am I sending it to? What it is about? What do I want to say with the letter? The second major bubble is the writing process itself. This is divided in three steps. First is the planning, where the writer would organize their ideas, they try to set goals for themselves, and they try to generate the first drafts or the first mental drafts, what they want to write, the different, for instance, if they would try to write a novel, the different scenes that they want to add, what type of novel it is. The second major bubble is the translating. This is the moment where the writer takes the previous ideas, the scenes for a novel, that here the writer would take those and start translating them into actual words. For instance, keeping with the novel, if I wanted to make a horror novel, this is where I try to describe the undescribable, describe the horrors that lie beyond the grove, for instance. The last step of this writing process is the reviewing. This is where the writer would evaluate, they would revise, they would try to edit every single step of the way, they would try to make their first draft look like a second draft, and their second draft look like it was all planned. It was all planned all along. This is also where Flower and Haze give us the only monitor that we have, because we can't monitor the writer's long-term memory, we can't monitor the task environment, but we can monitor the task itself. So we can actually see when one would start planning, either by taking notes, they would give ideas out loud. We can monitor when someone is actually writing and translating these ideas into words. And we can monitor when someone would try to edit or will start erasing and editing things on their text. The final bubble is the task environment. This is divided into two minor bubbles. The rhetorical problem that can be said is, what's the topic? Is it the topic adequate? Is, do I have an audience for the topic? What's the exigency? What's the level of exigency that this task needs to achieve? And it also contains context the text produced so far. Text produced so far under rhetorical problem are things that are actively trying to engage the writing process, because every single paragraph that someone would write affects in some way the paragraphs to come. So, having understood the Flowering-Hayes model, I would like to introduce one of my first revisions to this. So, for an L2, the first revision I want to talk about is in the writer's long-term memory. Here, for a second language writing, we need to account for two things. One is the proficiency in the target language of the writer, and the vocabulary of the target language of the writer. If we can't account for any of those, we actually can't say that a writer can achieve their task ahead. For instance, if when I was writing the script for this, if I didn't have the necessary vocabulary to do it, I don't think I would have done it in an effective way. So we have to account for the proficiency and the vocabulary of the writer in the target language before we even start to mingle with the writing process. But the second revision I would do to this model would be to the writing process, specifically in the planning stage. Here in the planning stage, I would add a vocabulary assessment. Why? Because when we write in a language that is not our own, we are actively aware of the vocabulary that we have, or rather than active, we are more aware that the kind of vocabulary that we have. So for different exigencies, for different tasks, we would need different vocabularies. And so I will need to know what kind of vocabulary do I have to use and what vocabulary do I have. And if do I need to acquire more to be more effective? That would be the final revision and the final model that I would be comfortable with trying to teach for a second language writing would be like this. The writer's long-term memory accounts for the proficiency and the vocabulary in the target language, and in the writing process itself, we can account for what our vocabulary is. While a lot more revisions can be made, they're not necessarily added directly to the model. But we can account when we translate that we also could be translating from one language to another. Instead of, we could have the idea of trying to say different scenes from a novel, we have to translate it first to Spanish to understand what we're trying to say, and then we would have to translate it into the target language. And then we would have to know if we needed more vocabulary, if we needed a different kind of vocabulary for that translation. The same time as evaluating and revising, this is something that we would have to revise a language that is not our own. But all these changes don't necessarily lie in the model itself, making it a lot more clutter that I already made it be. Finally, this model also takes some leaps in logic. For instance, it it requires that the writer actually has some proficiency in the language, because if the writer has no proficiency whatsoever, they would need either a third party, or they would need an, an another type of assistance to write in that language. So with that being said, that would be the end of my presentation. Here is my bibliography. Thank you for listening and watching.